Good morning, everybody. A very warm, I say warm advisedly, it's warmer in here than it is outside at least. Welcome to day 2 of the 12th Annual Learning and Teaching Conference here at Glasgow. Those of you who have checked your day 2 badges would have noticed we should have started a quarter of an hour ago at 9:15, but lots of people were still arriving, so we thought we would wait until we had a room that had enough people in it for it to look reasonable. And I'm strongly of the view that lots of people who came yesterday who haven't looked at their badges will suddenly arrive in about a minute's time thinking, oh, well, I can walk in now. So there we are. We'll see what happens. Welcome. If you weren't here yesterday, welcome, and I will give you some housekeeping things. If you were here yesterday, I'm going to say exactly what I said yesterday, so you've heard most of it before. My name is Matthew Williamson, and I'm the Director of the Learning Enhancement and Academic Development Service, Leeds, and we manage and arrange the conference on behalf of the university. A few housekeeping things. We're not expecting a fire alarm. You'll hear this quite a few times during the day. We're not expecting the fire alarm to go off. If it does go off, it's a continuous electronic noise, and lights will flash. And you should leave and go to the south flagpole, which I now know is that way. So yesterday I didn't know, but that's the front of the building, so it's that way. So please make sure you do that. Bear with me one second. Your programs are all on your badges. If you were a late registration, you won't have a personalised program. You will have been given a program. That program shows you sessions that still have spaces. So that shows you where you can go. You should, I hope, by now have downloaded the conference app. Any announcements will come through the app. We will email people. You will notice if you've had the app, there are a couple of changes to the schedule. So just so that if you haven't seen this, just bear with me. Workshop 6.6 is taking place in the Senate room, which is what it says on the paper copies of the program, but not on the app. So that's in the Senate room if you're going to session 6.6. Lightning Talk 7.3a has been withdrawn, so there'll only be 2 slots in 7.3. And session 10.3 has been cancelled. Unfortunately, the presenters are ill. So if you were due to go to 10.3, if you could go to 10.1, 10.2 or 10.4, we'd be grateful. There are 2 workshops in that slot as well, but they're already fully booked. So if you could go to 10.1, 10.2 or 10.4, we'd be grateful. If you've got any questions or you didn't catch that or you're not on the app, the team, the organising team will be on the desk upstairs outside the Butte Hall all day as they were yesterday. And as yesterday, all refreshments, etc. will be up in the Butte Hall. We've slightly rejigged lunch from yesterday because of the very long queue, so there will be more lunch food stations than yesterday, and the drinks will be in a different place. You'll see what it looks like when you get up there, but hopefully that will obviate some of the very long queues that there were yesterday. When you have 350 people trying to get through lunch, there's not a lot you can do, and, you know, we are British still, so, you know, we're used to queuing, but if you can bear with us while we do that. The other thing I should say is we are using Slido, particularly for panels. So if you go to Slido, the details are on the app. I don't know the web address, actually. Slido.com. I think it's slido.com. Anyway, if you look for the hashtag, which is LTConf19, you can submit questions for panels, but also you can vote there for the Best Presentation Prize, which we'll be awarding at the end of the day today. You can vote for yesterday's and today's, so don't think that you can only vote for people that you've heard today. It's only for full presentations, so not lightning talks and not workshops, but please do vote for what you think was the best presentation you've seen over the course of the 2 days. That's all I have to say, other than to say I hope you have a good day. I hope the weather doesn't put you off too much as you're moving from venue to venue, and hopefully the snow will hold off a bit. And I will speak to you again at the end of the day when I get the chance to give out the prizes. And I'm now going to hand over to our Assistant Vice Principal for Teaching and Learning, Professor Murray Fishbacker-Smith. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. So good morning, everybody. My role this morning is to introduce our keynote speaker, Preman Rajalingam, who I'll say a little bit more about later on, and also to kind of set the scene for today in line with the theme of the conference. So I thought I'd begin with some reflections on yesterday. So we talked a lot about inclusive learning spaces. That's inclusive spaces online and face-to-face. We talked about authentic assessment, we talked about authentic learning, flexibility in our approach, the use of technologies to allow a learning anywhere approach, and I heard a really interesting example of Ryan, one of our medical students, doing some MOOC work on the train to make his commute a much more productive travel time to university and allowing him to do other things in the evenings. And some of that discussion flowed through into dinner last night when Frank, Matthew and Preman and I went out for dinner, but not all of it. So some reflections on that discussion. Science fiction is a topic that divides us. Two of us were huge fans, and two of us were definitely not. Marvel comics and Marvel movies also divide us along similar lines, and perhaps unsurprisingly, so too do the Archers. I mean, who'd have thought? How can you not like the Archers? Other topics that are divisive, whiskey and the sewing bee. Don't know how you feel about those things, but we did talk about other things. And one thing that we really did agree on was the importance of social justice mission that higher education institutions have. And we talked about that quite a bit. And some of the threats to that in the current policy climate and the funding climate. So I'd just like to take a few minutes to just share some thoughts about that and to try and make some connections with the theme of the conference. What I'd like to do is to begin that by sharing an extract from a book that was written by two friends and former colleagues who are sadly no longer with us. Andy died 2 years ago and Fred just a few weeks ago. Both of them committed their professional lives to improving the prospects of young people by empowering them through access to and engagement with higher education. So just a short extract from their book, Higher Education and Social Justice. And I think I'll put my glasses on for this. So they write, there has been a long-standing tendency to separate debates about social justice from discussions about the purpose of higher education and of the best way of delivering so as to meet agreed aims. For traditionalists, a university is essentially a semi-monastic community of scholars, primarily pursuing knowledge for its own sake, with no necessary regard for the utility of their endeavours. For others, the purpose of higher education is to provide a context where the most able individuals can be prepared for demanding occupations requiring advanced skills, specialised knowledge, and the ability to solve problems within a disciplinary framework. Later in the book, they go on to write, the experiences of students in higher education have become increasingly diverse and fragmented. Whereas it was once common to think of the main divisions as represented by full and part-time students, or between mature and younger students, the lines of differentiation have become ever more complex. In some respects, a process of differentiation can be welcomed as a move away from a one-size-fits-all model to one that offers the possibility of becoming aligned with the non-linear and reflexive biographies that are the hallmark of late modernity. So Andy and Fred go on to argue that many of the ways in which as a sector, not as an institution, but as a sector, our policy environment and our institutional practices unfortunately achieve entirely the opposite of that social justice vision. But it's something that they are passionate about, and if you read that book, you will detect that very clearly. But it's also something that most of us in this room subscribe to, and I think that Glasgow University has a very strong commitment to. So it seems to me that through the collective power of the ideas and the energies and the commitments that we saw in this room yesterday and that we will see more of throughout the rest of the conference, that the opportunity and the responsibility that we have to develop approaches to learning and assessment and to create spaces that are virtual spaces and physical spaces where diversity is welcomed, inclusion is real, and where all students and staff can achieve amazing things, where that move away, as Andy and Fred write, from the one-size-fits-all model is actually an opportunity for good. So the theme of the conference is blended and active learning, where are we now and where do we want to be? And my response to that question is that we're at a point in the university's evolution where if we really embrace the active learning that we've been talking about, such as group-based and team-based learning that Preman will talk to us about, we can create opportunities for our diverse student body to really develop the bonds and the relationships with one another and with staff that we know are really, really impactful for them in their future. For example, we know that the research evidence on active learning, or what we sometimes call collaborative learning, points to improved retention and attainment for students from non-traditional backgrounds. And other studies show similar achievements, and I know that Preman's going to talk about some of that in his session. So active learning approaches alone are not enough, but rather they form part of a wider set of approaches, and we've talked about a lot of different things at this conference already. And the creation of inclusive study spaces and collaborative learning spaces is another part of that. And we've never had an investment on the scale that we're seeing at the university just now, and certainly in my memory, and I don't think we will have for a long time. So we have a fabulous opportunity to build on everything we're hearing about here and to embed them in a sustainable way and to transform the prospects of students for generations to come and achieve that social justice mission that many of us really are very passionate about. So that's a big answer to a question that the conference has proposed, but I think it's an important one. Linda's talk yesterday pointed to some of the complexities in institutions and all of the different elements that have to come together for us to achieve that vision, but something else that I picked up from the conference yesterday was that we don't have to change everything at once, and actually that some small changes that we build on can make a massive difference. And so whilst it can look like a huge agenda that we have to take, we have heard a lot of examples of where small things really make a big impact. So to Preman and how he might help us with this ambition. So Preman is an Assistant Dean of Educational Development and Senior Lecturer in Medical Education at LKC Medicine, which, if you're not familiar with, is Lee Kong Chian School of Medicine, which is a joint medical school between Imperial College London and Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He's a passionate advocate of active learning and of student-centred approaches to learning. And if you've seen the video that Frank and I have been sharing at various sessions, you will already know this. And he's also an expert in the pedagogy of higher education, in particular problem-based learning and team-based learning, as I've already mentioned. Prior to joining LKC Medicine, he was a pioneering faculty member at the Republic Polytechnic, where he helped to launch a diploma in biomedical electronics, and also at the Duke NUS Medical School, where he was active in medical education, evaluation and scholarship. And so that's the other thing that I think will come out of his talk, is where there's an opportunity to evaluate what we're doing and to produce some really interesting outputs on that. Having joined LKC Medicine in 2012, Preman was instrumental in setting up the team-based learning approach at the institution, and that's what we're going to hear more about. So he'll talk to us about the approach that he took, how they're trying to make that more sustainable, and how we might also be able to make more sustainable some of the things that we're trying to achieve at the University of Glasgow. So over to Preman. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very generous and kind introduction, Moira. Let me bring up my slides. I'd also like to thank the university, Frank, Matthew, Moira, for having me here. It seems a long way to come from Singapore, a very young, small medical school, only about 7 years old, to speak to you about our educational experiment. And I speak to you with some trepidation, because it's a unique situation we find ourselves in, right? But I hope that from what we've done over the last 7 years, there are some lessons which are transferable to your context, and I'll speak about them as we move on. Okay, so a little bit about the title of the talk while I get used to this room. The theme of the conference was active and blended learning. I added the word collaborative learning, and the words sustaining and scaling and sustaining, because I just wanted the subtext to be ABCs, right? But I'll explain what I mean by active, blended, and collaborative learning. There are really three major questions which I want to address in this particular talk. The first question is, why do something active, blended, and collaborative? Right? Second is, what really is team-based learning? Why is that a good example of active, blended, collaborative learning? And why use it? And the third question is, how do you sustain and scale an approach, like team-based learning, problem-based learning, or an active approach, over a period of time? Hold me accountable to answering these three questions, and if I don't, ask me questions at the end of the session. Okay? But before I get into the main bit of the talk, this talk is peppered with videos and activities. Okay, so I'm going to get you to watch videos at points. I'm going to ask you questions at points. I'm going to get you to discuss with the people next to you. So if you find yourself sitting alone, you may want to shift to be next to someone. Okay, the first thing I'm going to get everyone to do is watch this video very carefully. I'm going to ask you a question just after the video. Okay, this is your question. Think about what you've seen in that video. And if I were to give you an MCQ question with these 4 options, what would be your best answer? Okay? Discuss it with the person next to you. Yeah? You have an answer in your head, discuss it with the person next to you. Okay. Show of hands. Who thinks the answer is A? All right? B, C, and D. Okay. This is a bit of a trick question. The answer is all of the above. But if I had to pick one best answer, it would be C. Right? For those of you who have watched the longer team-based learning video, it'll probably make a bit more sense to you. For those of you who didn't, that's the most immediate thing they're doing. Oh, sorry, B. I've changed the options. The best answer is B. Okay, I repeat, B. So the most immediate thing they're doing is doing a test. They're actually doing a team test, right? If you watched that video, you may have noticed that they were discussing, they were entering answers on their iPad. Some were smiling at the camera, they were looking up notes, right? What is obvious, even if it wasn't obvious that they were doing a test, what is obvious is that they were engaged. What is obvious is that they were arguing with each other, trying to come to some kind of consensus. It's very hard to deny that some kind of learning is happening here, some kind of visible learning, to borrow someone else's term. Right? At this point, I want to introduce this book to anyone who hasn't already come across this. This is John Hattie's book on visible learning. It's about 10 years old now, and I believe that he has a new one coming out this year, which is updated with another 200 or 300 more meta-analysis. And it's a really, really, really good book trying to summarize the evidence that we have in higher education. The findings, with as with most meta-analyses, the findings are complex, right? The good news is almost everything you do works. Almost everything, right? You can give a lecture, give a quiz, almost everything works. But not everything works to the same degree, right? There are certain things that we know work a lot better, and there are certain things where we need to think about whether the effort we're putting in is worth the impact on students' learning. I'm not going to summarize the complex findings of this book, but I'm going to use John Hattie's own words to try to summarize some kind of very global ideas which come out from this. And he says, the remarkable feature of the evidence is that the greatest effect on student learning occurs when teachers become learners of their own teaching and when students become their own teachers. This doesn't prescribe a single way of doing things, but I think it's a really, really powerful statement about what we have known about teaching and learning in higher education for a long time. Okay. Let me move on to another very compelling piece of evidence for me. For those of you who haven't come across this, this is from the National Academy of Sciences. And again, it's another meta-review looking at active learning in the STEM fields, science, maths, engineering, technology fields. It's about 225 meta-analyses, and I know we had some discussion yesterday about what is active learning. They defined active learning quite loosely, right? Essentially, they compared traditional lecturing with any active approach, right? So the bar was set quite low. And what they found was quite interesting. The first thing they found was overall, it only improved exam scores by about 6%. And 6% doesn't seem like very much, but something is better than nothing. But for me, what's more important is the second part of that. They found that students in traditional lecture courses were 1.5 times more likely to fail than students in courses with active learning. And this resonates with what Moira brought up earlier about the social justice aspect of active learning. This is a summary of their data. As you can see, the orange curve, if you will, or the orange distribution is students who have done lecture, and the green distribution is active learning. And you can see a significant shift in the mean. And this means that students who would normally have dropped out of courses in science, engineering, mathematics, some of them may be minorities, some of them, unfortunately in these fields, women seem to drop out a little bit more. Active learning actually helps retain a lot more people into these fields. So there was a commentary on this study, and someone from the National Academy of Sciences actually said, given the evidence on active learning, it's unethical to teach in any other way. So these are very, very strong reasons why we should do something active and collaborative. But why don't we? So I was reflecting on this quite a bit, and I had two reasons. And yesterday I watched the first keynote by Professor Linda Price, right? And I thought the framework she presented was brilliant, right? And so I'm going to steal from that here again. I think there are two main reasons why, even though there's evidence for active learning, for collaborative learning, we don't do more of it. Okay? The first thing has to do with perhaps what I would call institutional departmental factors, the two bubbles in the top and on the right side. And these have to do with systems which are in place or not in place to support the implementation of active collaborative learning. Right? I know this model is intended more for the implementation of technology in learning, but I think it works really well for any innovation learning. The other thing is it really has to do with the teacher's own beliefs and academic context. What the teacher thinks is good teaching, and that's often shaped by their own experience as students. So rather than tell you what the barriers are, I decided to tell you why we at LKC Medicine, and perhaps I, am such a strong believer in active collaborative learning. So indulge me a little bit while I tell you a bit of my personal story. I actually started off as an engineer, a biomedical engineer. And I was actually not a very good engineering student. I mean, if I stuck with engineering, I probably never would have become an academic. I somehow ended up in engineering, being very bad at math. Right? So I was the middle of the curve student, if you will, at risk of failing, never enjoyed the lectures, right? Could never keep up, why am I doing this? Where's the problem solving? Where's the engagement? Right? Years later, that led me to do a PhD in educational psychology, where I actually looked at the connection between mathematics and engineering. And this is actually a word cloud from my dissertation. But because I was never quite satisfied with my higher education experience, I was never convinced, or I was never to that lecturing was something I wanted to promote when I was in a position to, inform practice. On the flip side of it, I work with a lot of faculty, and I think faculty forget that they're often the top of the heap. They say, lecturing worked for me, right, because I was inspired by this particular lecturer or teacher, and I want to go ahead and inspire the next generation of me. They forget that the me they're inspiring doesn't reflect the vast majority of the class, right? And while they may be very evidence-based in other areas, they sometimes, not always, sometimes choose to ignore the evidence in teaching and learning. So that's about me, right? And that's why I, as a teacher, personally believe that active learning works. And let me talk a little bit more about the context that we're from in Singapore and why we were in a position to implement team-based learning on a very large scale. For those of you who don't know Singapore, this is the island of Singapore. It's tiny. It's about 25 kilometers by 40 kilometers wide. There are 6 million people living here, right? The green dots that you see are the major public hospitals in Singapore, right? We're a medical school, and Singapore doesn't have very many medical schools. Actually, for over 100 years, there was just one medical school. It was called, I think, the King George's Medical School. King George the 7th or 5th, I can't remember, 5th maybe. And it was set up in 1905. It was eventually renamed the Yong Lu Lin School of Medicine, and it has been the only medical school in Singapore for the longest time. In 2007, the Duke NUS School was built. Duke NUS is an American style or American model of medical education. It takes in graduate students who already have a first degree. And the purpose of Duke NUS Medical School was to train clinician scientists. So many of them actually go on and do a PhD. And actually, very recently, in 2017, the Lee Kong Chian School of Medicine was set up. And we take in about 150 undergraduate students a year. So for one thing which helped shape the context, I mean, the powers that be could have decided, let's expand the two existing schools. Let's, expand the capacity. These are well-established schools, especially the Yong Lu Lin School of Medicine. It's been around over 100 years, very well regarded. Why not just expand the intake if more doctors are needed? But I think there was a recognition that some level of competition and some newness is a good thing. So we started a new school and we had a mandate to do things in a different way from scratch. Okay? And Singapore likes to partner internationally. So for multiple reasons, the partner we found was Imperial College. Right? It is a joint medical school. It's a slightly unusual relationship. It's not a school where the Imperial curriculum has been bought and is being delivered in Singapore. It was an 18-year agreement signed between the two universities to build a medical school from scratch. It's a 5-year MBBS program as opposed to the Imperial College's 6-year program. They do an intercalated BSc year. We do not for regulatory reasons. And the curriculum was actually designed bespoke for Singapore by faculty at Imperial College and faculty in Singapore. And the difficult thing or the interesting thing is any changes to curriculum have to be agreed by committees on both sides, which is a strength and also sometimes a pain. And for now, we have an 18-year collaboration agreement between the two institutions. So to reflect that it is a joint degree, the degree that the students actually get, the transcript, the degree has the crest of both institutions. Right? But the other thing worth noting is, even though it is a joint degree, it was the Singapore government's intention that the graduates of this program don't come back to the UK to work. It was really meant to train doctors to stay in Singapore. And so for that reason, we haven't pursued GMC accreditation, but that's a bit of a background. Okay, so that's the context. But when you start a new medical school, you have a real opportunity to look around the world at best practice and do things which are new, but also take take what works from other contexts and implement it scratch implement it in your new medical school. So one of the things we did was we did away with traditional subjects. For those of you who are familiar with the medical curriculum, you may be looking for subjects like, this is the first and second year curriculum. You may be looking for subjects like anatomy, physiology, biochemistry. You don't see them because the course is very much organized around system-based teaching blocks. This is something that we learned from Imperial, and I think may not be new in a lot of medical schools around the world, but it was somewhat unique in a Singapore context to introduce this. The other thing that we could do was that we could be very purposeful about introducing technology throughout the medical curriculum. Some of this technology enhances the teaching, to borrow the framework from yesterday's presentation. And some of this technology, I do think actually does transform the teaching a little bit. And let me point out a few examples here. So on your top left corner, you see iFolio. So our students actually, on their clinical placements, don't carry around any pieces of paper or logbooks or anything like that. In fact, what they're given is an iPad mini. And all of the cases that they see, all their assessment is done on that iPad mini. In addition, all the lectures or the video recorded lectures which they are given to them to prepare for the TBL is also available on that iPad mini. And it stays with them throughout the 5 years of their medical program and beyond. We also integrate technology quite a bit into our teaching of anatomy and our science labs. So this is an area where I think technology, more than enhance the teaching of a subject, really does transform it. So one of the big debates in anatomy education is the use of cadavers, right? Do cadavers or cadaveric dissection, does that teach anatomy well? For a number of reasons, principally the difficulty in getting high quality cadavers and the cost of maintaining a lab which has cadaveric dissection. We've done away with having wet cadavers. In fact, we use these things in the top left corner, which are actually real human bodies, but plastinated. This teaching is supplemented by digital dissection. And what is quite different is in addition to seeing the plastinated specimen, the digital specimen, the students also learn using ultrasound, X-rays, CT scans, where they actually visualize the anatomy in a human body. On top of that, having plastinated specimens, we are now experimenting with 3D printing, right, of these real human specimens. And the advantage of 3D printing is that you can bring the plastic 3D print home with you or out of the lab to study. Another unique thing we could introduce was clinical communication, practical skills, and clinical methods, which happen in any medical school. But these are actually first-year students who are engaged in these approaches. First-year students who are actually training not with a real patient. This gentleman in pink over here is a simulated patient. And if you look at the background in the corner, this is the student recording her interaction with that simulated patient for review later. They also learn practical skills and clinical methods, and if you may notice here, is that same simulated patient who follows through with all aspects of the clinical skills. Okay, and the other major thing which we could introduce is we could do away with face-to-face lectures. So we have no large group lectures in the first and second year. We have very few lectures in the clinical years. Team-based learning takes up about 60% of the time in the first and second year, and it continues in the clinical years to a significant extent, though in much smaller groups in the clinical setting. So I've talked a little bit about active, collaborative, blended learning. I'm going to show you a video now of what team-based learning actually is. It is a very, very staged process of active, blended, collaborative learning, so it's good to watch a video to see what it actually is in class. Hi, you're about to watch a team-based learning video. My name is Dr. Preman Rajalingam, and I am the lead for team-based learning facilitation here at LKC Medicine. In each session, there is a team-based learning facilitator and content experts who are the faculty who run the sessions. Team-based learning is a sequence of in-class activities designed to engage students in meaningful learning. Team-based learning begins with students preparing for class by going through TBL preparation materials. Learning outcomes are provided for each topic to indicate what students are expected to learn from the material. The first activity in class is an individual readiness assurance process. This is an MCQ test where students are tested on their understanding of concepts which are reviewed before class. Students review concepts before class on video annotated PowerPoints, textbook materials, or recorded lectures. In this scene, you see students engaged answering these MCQ questions. It is very much like a test and is conducted under test conditions. Students will not know if they've got the right or wrong answer, but in a minute, they will do the same test in their teams as part of the readiness assurance process. And at this point, they'll be given immediate feedback on whether they've got the right or wrong answer. You will see the class go from pin drop silence to an active discussion. Student teams have a discussion, commit to an answer, and electronically receive immediate feedback on whether they've got the answer right or wrong. This drives the discussion and makes sure that students justify their answers to each other before committing. Often in the team, someone is able to explain what the right answer is to his teammates. Answers which students still are unable to get right may be raised at the class level and discussed with the entire class. We call this the burning questions.
Argument for D, whereas for E, it's like completely no argument for.
If it's a very, very high risk and they actually endanger themselves, then they may put issue.
As you can see, students are actively engaged throughout the whole process instead of passively sitting and receiving information. In the discussion, students challenge each other's answers and peer teach.
This term was actually coined by
The content expert is then able to correct any misconceptions which arose and clarify any tricky issues. The purpose of the IRA, TIRA, and burning question discussion is to make sure that students understand key concepts, key basic concepts which they can then apply in a realistic setting. This process also prepares them for the application exercise, which happens later on in the day. During the application exercise, students are presented with case studies or vignettes that reflect the significant real-world problems faced by professionals in the field. They are often presented with real test results, scans, and even simulated patients that make the cases more authentic. Early exposure in the first and second year to these kinds of problems allows students the opportunity to start to think and act like future doctors. Doing this in the classroom setting allows them to make mistakes and learn from them.
I think because when we start to work on alternative medical treatment, we somehow thought like traditional Chinese medicine or something like that. Oh, it's funky, not really evidence-based medicine.
Just like in the hospital, students work in teams to apply their knowledge and propose specific solutions to the problems. The clock counts down as they discuss, look up resources, and try to find the best possible solution to each of the questions posed to them. Each team makes a specific choice, then simultaneously reports their answers. They discuss their answers with each other, especially answers which may be different, and try to convince each other that each have chosen the best solution. Often, students come up with brilliant justifications. The content expert can then finally come in and clarify any issues as well as highlight gaps in students' knowledge.
I like these very real challenges, And this is based on the real-time.
This active engage process allows students to engage in a deep, meaningful discussion with content experts and each other. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. If you have any questions about team-based learning, please contact us.
So the first video you saw, which I showed right at the beginning, that was actually the students doing the team readiness assurance portion. And that video was when we first started with our first batch of students 6 years ago. The video you have here, which is a lot more polished, shows you a class, and maybe I think a couple of years ago. And that's pretty much how it looks like now. As you can see, team-based learning is a very, very staged, sequenced process. It's not just using teams, right? If there's one thing I could change about team-based learning, it would be the name, team-based learning. Because everyone thinks that the moment you have a team, you're doing team-based learning. It's great to have a team, but one of the things which makes team-based learning work is all the things which come before the team works together, the activities, the questions, etc., which support the team in their learning. Time for another discussion. We've been speaking a lot about active learning, collaborative learning, and team-based learning. The engineer in me likes sets. So think about this individually again, right? Which of the following diagrams best represents the relationship between collaborative, team-based learning, and active learning? You can think about this individually, but even better, once you have an answer in your head, discuss it with the person next to you. All right. Show of hands. Who thinks the answer is A? Who thinks the answer is B? C? D? Okay. So the answer is B, right? And this slide is not really about team-based learning. Or this slide is really to ask you to think about this. Is it possible to do collaborative learning which is not active? You know, often when I ask this question, you can be in a group, you can sit down and you can not participate, and that's collaborative, not active learning. I would argue if someone is just in a group and sitting there and not doing anything, that's not truly collaborative learning. For it to be collaborative learning, right, you would need to critique each other's ideas. You need to challenge each other. You need to say what you think about something, right? For it to be collaborative learning, by definition, it does become active learning. Another point about this is that not all collaborative, all collaborative learning is a form of active learning, right? But not all active learning is a form of collaborative learning. You can engage your students in an active way, one-to-one. I think that's perfectly fine. The other thing worth thinking about is TBL. TBL is just one example of collaborative learning. There are many other good examples of collaborative learning, problem-based learning, case-based teaching, etc. Right? I think what TBL brings to the table is like a recipe, right? And it's a recipe if you follow kind of faithfully and then modify as you become more of an expert, you're ensured of getting quite good outcomes. Sorry, the right answer was B. B. Sorry, yeah. Yeah. I tend to swallow my words. Yes, the right answer was B. All right. Okay, so the thing about team-based learning is we didn't invent it. It's not new. It's been around for a long time. It's actually been around since the 70s, started in business school. Professor Larry Michelson, I believe, started it in the University of Ohio. And his story was that his class, he used to teach in a collaborative, interactive way. There was a recession, and everyone went to university, and his class size tripled. And after his class size tripled, he still wanted to teach a large group in an interactive, collaborative way. And over the years, he formulated team-based learning. So team-based learning is not new. It's become actually a lot more popular in, I think, medical education over the last 10 or 15 years. Health professionals education, not just medical education. I think what is unique about the way we do it is the extent to which we've committed to it, and the fact that we do it across all courses, not just in particular courses. So this actually kind of shows you what team-based learning looks like in our context. When we do team-based learning, the students meet for the whole day. So they're given about 4 to 6 hours of preparation material. If you ask them, sometimes they take twice that amount of time to actually do the preparation. They come into class, they do an individual test, then the team test, and then we do something called the burning questions, which is something we have modified and added to team-based learning, but it's very much consistent with the principles of team-based learning. After which they go for lunch, right? Let me shine over here as well. They go for lunch over here, and then they continue with the team application exercise, which for me is really the most important part of team-based learning. It's where they work in teams to solve realistic problems, which are really the heart of team-based learning and which lead to the deep learning that we all want. Okay. It's pretty easy to implement team-based learning in your class, and there's lots written about it. But I think one of our challenges was scaling up team-based learning to a much larger number. So we started, in that first video you saw, there were 54 students, right? Our current intake is 150 students, and we are future-proof to 250 students who will sit in that round room that you're seeing. And when you want to do things on a large scale as an institution, I think there are a few things you learn along the way. You do need to think about a few, and at least 3 factors which I think on reflection were really important in helping us scale. The first is the learning spaces. There's no one way to design learning spaces, but the learning spaces need to be team-centric, and I'll explain what that means in a bit. You need to pay a lot of attention to your digital ecosystem or your e-learning, and it really helps if you have a digital learning team which works with the faculty from the start. And the third aspect is really team teaching, which I will speak about in a bit. So let me go through the 3 aspects. The first thing is team-centric learning spaces. So this is a photo of the learning studio, which you saw in the video as well. The most innovative thing about this is not the shape of the room. Everyone looks at this and they think the most innovative thing about this is the shape of the room. The room is shaped that way. It was a design choice. Some theaters, some lecture rooms are round, some are a little bit more square. The most innovative thing in this room is the fact that we decided to have small tables. Tables which are small enough that when people are speaking across the table, it's like a rugby huddle. In the tables are microphones, so they can pick up these microphones, and as a team, speak to any other team in the room. So to make this space team-centric, it's great to have this 2-tiered structure, etc., but what we were really thinking about was people can have conversations within the team, and anyone in that room can stand up, pick up a microphone, and talk to anyone else in that room, whether that other person was a person in another team or the faculty member. And that's what determined our design quite a bit. And we have other room spaces, some of them flat, some of them tiered, right? Some of them concentric circles, but the tables are consistent, the small tables, the spacing between them, and the fact that you see these screens are all around. It really helps to have screens all around because then people don't have to keep turning around to face you. It's uncomfortable for teachers, because half the time, I know this is uncomfortable for me because half the time my back is facing you guys, but in a round room, half the time, half the students are not facing you. They're facing each other, and that's okay because it's team-centric design. You just have to get teachers to adapt to that. I think that makes a difference when you scale up. Right? That room can hold 250. It doesn't feel like 250. The second thing is e-learning. Having an e-learning system which we can modify, having an e-learning team which is receptive to make changes, etc. So a lot of what we have designed is built on something called LAMS. LAMS is an open source software. For those of you who are interested, it's LAMS. So we've made modifications to it. So of course you could, if you're doing this in a small class, you could do it on pen and paper. There are little scratch cards which can help as well. But we decided to do everything online because it gives us certain things which we think enhance the learning experience and possibly even transform it. So this is how it looks like from a student view. When the student's doing the individual quiz, it's an MCQ. But what we've added just below is this little scroll bar, right? Which tells them, how confident are you of your answer? And the great thing about having a technology solution is when they do it as a team, right now they see a little bubble with all their faces, and it tells them how confident their teammates were of the answer. This is an interesting scenario, right? A couple of members who chose option B but said they were not confident at all. Couple who chose option E, well, their confidence together is about the confidence of this individual. This individual was 40% confident the answer was option A, right? So that having that information, we think shapes the conversation in the teams a little bit differently as well. And we won't be able to do that without technology, right? And then, having discussed this particular question as a team, they would ask a burning question. Right? We would like to clarify why obligatory energy expenditure consists of B, Okay, you can see the example of that. And having all of this technology integrated into team-based learning, there's something very interesting for the faculty. While students are working on these questions, we almost have real-time reports of how they're doing. So while they're working on the individual readiness assurance, the IRA, you can see here, maybe I'll point from here so both sides can look at me. While they're doing the individual test, you can see real-time how the students are doing. Question 1's not a problem. Everyone in class is getting it right. Let's look at question 2. Only 37% of the class is getting it right. And while the students are doing this, the faculty is panicking in the corner. Right? We know that they're going to get question 2 wrong. Right? Is that because we screwed up? Is that because we wrote a question that was unclear? Or is it an issue which the students really struggle with? At the team level, they still get it wrong. And at the burning question level, this is all the questions they ask about question 2. So while the students are working on the questions, we're getting real-time feedback, if you will, about their performance. And then we go off into our own corner and we start Googling, right? It's true, it's what you do. You Google, you see whether you've missed something, right? And we won't be able to do this without technology. And I think on a large scale, I can't emphasize this enough. You really need a team of learning designers to work with you. Okay, I'll speed up a little bit. I see the time is going. The third thing is really team teaching. This is something which is very close to my heart. I think when you have large-scale team-based learning the way we do, and you bring in teachers from many different backgrounds, you need to acknowledge that people have different specializations and different skills. So we have content experts and we have pedagogical experts. Of course, there's an overlap between the two, right? But the different expertise is quite well recognized. Our content experts are both clinicians and scientists. Our scientists are principally responsible for the IRATs and the TRATs and the video recorded lectures. Our clinicians are principally responsible for the application exercises in a medical school. You can imagine how that would be different in a slightly different school. And our team-based learning facilitators are people who deeply understand the pedagogical approach, who are comfortable facilitating a large class discussion, and in many ways ensure consistency session to session. Right? Because there's so many things going on with the technology, with the large group, etc. It's really useful to have a team-based learning facilitator there over a period of time to make sure that the class runs consistently. So those are the three main factors that we had to think about. Or we didn't think about them beforehand. These were things which we iteratively had to design into the system as we scaled up. But on reflection, I think these were the three factors which are really important. There is an advantage of doing things on a large scale. And Maura, Frank, and I talked about this last night. When you're starting a new school and doing something on a large scale, the first few years you don't even think about research, right? You don't, because you're too busy doing other things. But doing things on a large scale consistently, after a while, when you have a bit of time, you realize that it provides you opportunities to look at the mechanics of this approach in a certain way, and perhaps that will inform teaching and learning in other contexts. So one of the things we thought about was, what's the psychological basis for team-based learning? So we talked about each of its individual phases, and we said, let's propose a psychological basis. What happens when they're doing the preparation? Well, actually, they're doing self-guided preparation and knowledge consolidation. What happens when they're doing the individual readiness test? They're engaged in retrieval practice. They're trying to retrieve bits of information from their knowledge consolidation while you're asking them questions. What happens when you're doing the readiness assurance test? They're engaged in peer elaboration, right? Or I put down this answer because I remember that, and this is why it makes sense to me. What happens when they do the burning questions? They're putting down their questions which they don't understand, right? And they're receiving feedback from the faculty, but also from other teams. And we propose that the application exercises actually aid in transfer of knowledge. Of course, one may argue that all of these processes somewhat happen in various stages, but from what we've looked at, you can kind of differentiate them, and the students kind of understand and report that some of these underlying psychological processes are more important in certain areas than others. There's another process which is not in here, which we think is really important, and I think we're going to talk about that, is sleep, right? I think it's really important for students to study, sleep, right? Let that consolidate into long-term memory, and then go through this process of retrieval, peer elaboration, feedback, transfer. Go through cycles of this. Right? So that's one thing we've proposed and on how we think team-based learning works. But what do the students think? Now you can get to see some of my fancy PowerPoint. Okay? So when you do things on a large scale, you do a lot of student evaluation, and we often ask them about these 4 aspects of team-based learning: the preparation, the individual readiness test, the team readiness test, and the application exercise. And we wanted to know, from a student's perspective, what's important. And this is where my PowerPoint fails, because I gave up on trying to draw something this complex. But okay, so what we found is, from a student's perspective, right, each of these is important. Each of these determines how much they learn. And this is a self-report based on all the questions we asked our students. This is how much each of these affect each other. This is the core process, right? The purple is the core process. We also wanted to see what affected the core process. So of course, prior knowledge affects preparation material and the IRAs. Teamwork, interestingly, affects the readiness assurance process. The quality of application exercises had a very strong impact on the application exercise. What about the content expert and the facilitator? This is really interesting. We found that the content expert, from the student's perspective, influenced the team readiness assurance for some reason and the application exercise. But what we couldn't explain is why the facilitator had a direct and not insignificant impact on the student's learning. Right? Similarly, content expert had an impact on topic interests, etc. So this is a complex picture, but we can start to build models of what is important to a student in team-based learning, what they think impacts their learning. Okay? Another question we could ask about is engagement. Engagement is really important. So, we said, what can we do to enhance engagement? The students hated this study because the way we measured engagement is we interrupted them at the middle of each phase. While they're doing preparation, without telling them, we'll say, stop. Now we want you to answer these 5 validated questions about how engaged you're feeling right now. You're doing an individual test, stop. How engaged are you right now? They hated us by the end of the session, but we got this data. This is cheating a little bit with statistics because if you look at the scale has been somewhat truncated. But what this shows you is that engagement is pretty high throughout, right? It's a 5-point scale. But there's a predictable pattern. We repeated this for 2 studies, and we had the same pattern. Preparation, it's average. It goes up when they do an individual test. It goes up higher when they do a team test. It drops when it goes to the burning question. It goes up when they discuss in their teams, and it drops when it goes to the class. Our conclusion about this is interesting. Students are more engaged when they are talking in their small group. They're not as engaged when they're talking at the class level or when they're talking to the subject matter expert or the facilitator, but that tells us something about this process. And we're not saying do away with the class discussion, but as much as faculty want students to stand up and ask questions in class, the students are most engaged when they're talking in their small groups. Okay? This is another model, and interestingly, we found that their engagement during the team readiness portion of the day was what somewhat predicted their academic achievement. We gave them a quick test at the end of this experiment, about 12%. Not large, but again, we're trying to build models of what's happening in the student's head. I'll skip past the last quickly. Okay, maybe I'll do just a couple more. Another question is, should you grade the different portions of team-based learning? Back to some PowerPoint magic again. And this is, okay, so essentially, we wanted to look at the impact of grading the individual readiness tests on their preparation and exams. So this is a rather busy slide, but we actually were able to do a kind of quasi-experimental study. Everything above the red line was when we graded TBL. Everything below the red line was when we didn't give any grades at all. And we only graded, the grades for TBL only contributed 5% to the overall mark. It wasn't very much. I don't know whether you see this, it's a bit hard to interpret from here, but actually what we found is the moment we stopped grading, and we could control, interestingly, because this was the same cohort, the cohort 2014 was the same cohort, was that the moment you stopped grading, it affected their performance in the exam for about 5%, but it affected the amount of material they download by about 30 or 40%. Right? So something's happening when you don't grade. Again, it's worth understanding these mechanics when you do something like team-based learning. Let me skip past the last one quickly. The last one, we just quickly looked at the burning questions. What kind of questions do students ask? I don't know whether this is good news or bad news, but as first, second year medical students ask, most of the questions, we mapped the questions they asked to Bloom's taxonomy. Most of the questions they asked were lower order questions. Only about 20% were higher order questions. May not be bad news because I think that's the level expected of them in the first and the second year. What was really interesting for us is when we looked at the questions change with time. The students tend to ask more questions, better questions. That didn't change with time. We looked at the demographic of which teams submitted questions, and we found something quite interesting. The teams which did better in the individual and team tests were the teams which are submitting more questions, and the teams in the top quartile of performance submitted twice as many higher order questions than the teams in the bottom quartile. Again, this is information that we don't know what to do with yet, but then we're studying our practice in a lot of details, and it gives us the opportunity to modify what we're doing. Okay, I've skipped past a few studies, and I want to come back to the main point of this presentation. So the title of this presentation was Active, Blended, Collaborative, lessons learned in scalability or sustaining and scaling. I hope I've convinced you that team-based learning is a recipe for active, blended, collaborative learning. We have learned that to scale, at least to the numbers that we have. The team-centric learning spaces are important, the e-learning ecosystem is important, and teaching in teams is important. Sustaining is something that I worry about. And I worry about it because there's a few interesting papers out about problem-based learning in Maastricht and erosion of principles. I've been in situations where you start something at an institution, and after a few years, it becomes routine. And when it becomes routine, it becomes less good, right? I don't really have a solution for sustaining other than quoting John Hattie again. What he says in blue, teachers need to become learners of their own teaching. Right? You need to continuously study your own teaching unbiasedly, right? And try to improve that, try to tweak that. That's the only way I think you can continue to sustain an innovative approach like team-based learning or any active collaborative approach. So thank you very much for listening. That's our first batch of students which graduated last year. You saw some of them in the video at the start. They're all young doctors now in the Singapore healthcare system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Preman. That was really interesting. For those of you who arrived a little bit later, you may not be aware that we started late and we have permission from the organisers to go sort of 10 minutes into coffee time. So there is some time for questions for Preman if you have any just now. And I think we have some roving microphones. We do. So, looking left and right, it's harder than you thought. We'll start here and then, so David first and then somebody else had their hand up. No? Okay, David, on you go. Can you wait for the microphone to reach you, please?
I just wonder if there are any students that don't thrive in that particular environment. I mean, we're doing a workshop this afternoon about autistic students, and I wondered if that was a particular problem for students with issues with social interaction and extroversion and things like that.
So I suspect you're right. We've been fortunate enough that we haven't had students with that particular disability, which stops them working in teams. We have had, as all medical schools have had, a couple of students who've had to leave us, but that has had, and interestingly, the teams pick up on the fact that these students are struggling, but they don't struggle academically. They struggle because of professionalism issues. Right? It just happened maybe once or twice. By and large, we've been lucky enough not to have students with autism or other issues which may then hinder their ability to work in a team. Should that happen, I think that the university has to provide support for these individuals. But what we do make quite clear to the students before they join the school is that this is how the teaching is delivered. We run workshops, we invite them to come in, we do mock sessions as well. Yeah. So there's a certain amount of self-selection into the system.
It's not very inclusive.
I agree. There are some aspects which I think it's not very inclusive in the sense that you may exclude individuals who have social anxiety and difficulty working, but I think it's inclusive in other ways. It's inclusive in the sense that individuals who may not have necessarily done well or may have been at risk of failing are less likely to fail in this system. And that's what I believe, and that's what I think is somewhat supported by the evidence. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, have you?
Thank you very much. I'm wondering if you have some general figures in terms of the proportions of the different kinds of faculty members. So you mentioned you have scientists, clinicians, and facilitators, yeah. And certainly some of them are mixed.
Yeah,
so.
yeah. The facilitators is the smallest group. We have only 6 facilitators, 2 of them who do it to a larger extent, and the other 4 of us who have multiple roles, multiple hats. So that's a really small group of individuals who I think it's necessary. We're sometimes jokingly called the TBL police, right? We're involved in more than just the delivery. We also help support the faculty in terms of faculty development. We help review the questions, etc. In terms of clinicians, we have hundreds. Yeah, and that's because a particular specialist may come in for one session. One of the reasons we split the role is also to help support these individuals who are actually not full-time teachers. They're full-time medics. They're full-time medics who are part-time teachers. How do we support them to teach in a different way? With scientists, 20s, 30s, yeah.
Okay, probably time for one last question before coffee. Oh, Dawn, go on.
Team-based learning relies upon the test, multiple choice test. I wonder how applicable you think it is to subjects for which there isn't a right answer.
The individual and team portion does rely quite a bit on the MCQ test. So I think you need to think about it this way. That even in medicine and science and in any other area, when you get to the higher levels, right, it's not about the right answer, it's about judgment. So in the application exercise, if you're creative, things don't have to be close-ended. You can set up situations with options or without options which get people or teams to make a judgment and then defend that judgment. I agree with you. There is a limitation with the MCQ questions in the IRATs and the TRATs. We're currently working on very short answer type questions for the IRATs and the TRATs. What's not quite there yet is the technology to automatically score that and give feedback. The only reason we use the MCQs is because it doesn't involve, on a large scale, it saves the teacher from having to mark them individually, and you get this almost real-time feedback. Yeah. That's it. I mean, back to the earlier question. In university, if we're teaching them about right-wrong answers, then it's not university. At any subject, the application would work. It's about judgment. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So Preman said in his session that sleep is important. I agree with that, but so too is coffee. So I think we should stop there and have time for some coffee. But if you could join me once more in saying thank you very much to Preman for a really interesting talk.